Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, July 27th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, Congress can pass legislation, but government still has to implement it. A look at last week on Capitol Hill with Mitchell Miller. Plus, the Trump administration continues to champion deregulation, but agencies still have thousands of regulatory actions on their to-do lists. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. Fired probationary employees from the Department of Homeland Security and the Interior Department are continuing to challenge the legality of their terminations from last year. This time, they're taking their fight to federal appeals court. The ex-employees are challenging the Merit Systems Protection Board's decision to dismiss their case. For more, Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me now. Justin, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
What's the latest in this long-running legal battle for these probationary employees?
So these are probationary employees who worked at the Interior Department and DHS, as you mentioned. Last year, Interior fired about 1,700 probationary employees, while DHS fired just over 300 of those employees. And this was, of course, part of a much broader wave of probationary firings. But these employees were actually granted class certification before the MSPB last year, and their cases were moving along there until last fall when the MSPB ruled in the DHS employees case that the MSP doesn't have jurisdiction to hear their case because they were arguing that it was a RIF in everything but name only, and the MSPB essentially rejected that argument. And so now MSPB ruled against the Interior Department employees in the same vein, and now they are bringing their case before the Court of Federal Appeals. They just filed a July 7th brief, essentially saying that the MSPB erred in its ruling and that this was a RIF in everything but name only, and that it was an illegal RIF at that. And so now the Court of Appeals has to decide on the MSPB's judgment to see whether it will go back to the board.
And how did the MSPB get to the decision to dismiss these cases?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it was big news when MSPB granted these class certifications to the DHS probationary workers and then to the Interior probationary workers. That allowed them to kind of move forward as a class rather than pursuing individual cases. But the same administrative judge that granted that class certification was the one that rejected the arguments around RIF procedures and sided with the government's arguments that these were not RIFs, that the firings were done based on the employee's probationary status and that therefore she does not have jurisdiction, and MSPB does not have jurisdiction to review that case. So again, the DHS case, the MSPB ruled last September against them. The Interior Department employee case, that just happened in March, and they are able to bring their cases together to the Federal Court of Appeals because those were two extremely similar rulings by the MSPB.
How does this case fit into the broader set of legal challenges against the probationary employee firings?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, there was the big lawsuit last year that the American Federation of Government Employees and other federal employee unions brought against the probationary firings. They argued that, the Office of Personnel Management was the one directing these terminations. They were falsely claiming performance issues, and that thousands of employees had received identical termination letters that their supervisors had, in some cases, said they never wrote or approved. And so they were actually successful in those arguments before federal court. And in September, the judge partially granted summary judgment, ruling that OPM's orders and mass terminations were unlawful. But the judge in that case did not order reinstatement, essentially finding that, it was not meaningful to do that at that point because employees had moved on to other jobs at that point and things like that. And in some cases, agencies had actually already foregone plans to re-terminate probationary employees. And so some had already gone back, but at least in the DHS and Interior Department cases, those employees were largely not reinstated. And so now they're moving forward to still get these terminations settled before the MSPB rather than the big federal court cases that we've seen.
What are the next steps in this particular case involving DHS and Interior?
Yeah, so the government has until September to respond to the initial filing by the employees and their attorneys. And so this could move forward this fall and play out in the Court of Appeals. And if the Court of Appeals does eventually rule in their favor, then they will be able to, again, bring their case before the MSPB. And that would be pretty interesting because we're kind of seeing the contours around the MSPB change drastically. As our colleague Drew Friedman reported earlier this week, MSPB is no longer calling itself independent on its public-facing website and in public-facing materials. That comes after some Supreme Court decisions that have called into question or have essentially verified President Trump's ability to fire independent officers and employees. So it's interesting to see, how kind of some of these issues around the MSPB, what they will take up, what they will rule around the ability of the Trump administration to make changes to federal employees, how those contours are going to continue to change as cases like this move forward.
That's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, thanks for the update.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, Congress can pass legislation, but government still has to implement it. A look at last week on Capitol Hill with Mitchell Miller. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. It was a busy week on Capitol Hill, with House lawmakers advancing spending, defense, and other major legislation before leaving town. What happens next will depend on both the Senate and the agencies responsible for implementation. Here with the latest is Mitchell Miller, Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, great to have you on today. Thanks so much for joining me.
Absolutely.
There has been a lot going on up on the Hill this past week. Maybe good news, the House passed its $95 billion Reconciliation 3.0 and a continuing resolution. Let's start there. What's in them? What's controversial?
Well, first of all, you've got about $67 billion for the war with Iran. That inherently is controversial just because there's so much opposition to the war here in Congress, at least from Democrats and from some Republicans. Then you also have within that budget blueprint for Reconciliation 3.0 about $10 billion for so-called election security measures. All those are kind of related to the SAVE Act and what the president has been pushing for. And that's really another huge controversial point because it can't go through the Senate in a conventional way because of the filibuster and the fact that Democrats are not going to support that. But there's also some Republicans, including people like North Carolina's Tom Tillis, who are really skeptical about the fact that they don't think that this reconciliation bill can get passed in time, that you could put in all these election reforms ahead of the midterms. They think it's kind of a pie in the sky type of thing. So it's really put Senate Majority Leader John Thune over a barrel in connection with this. And then the continuing resolution, that was a piece of good news. Of course, we're usually used to hearing about that sometime in the fall, but here we are in the middle of the summer and it gets passed by the House. Surprise, surprise. So it was a good week last week for House Speaker Mike Johnson. However, that doesn't mean it's going to be a nice couple of weeks moving forward here for the Senate, because Senate Majority Leader Thune also has some issues in connection with the continuing resolution that he has to work out with his conference.
Well, and the Senate will be home alone. The House is out of town. So it'll be interesting to see just how the Senate plays this. But another piece of legislation that's stuck between the two chambers, I guess, is the NDAA. The House passed their version. What's the initial take from the Senate side?
Well, the NDAA is kind of stuck right now in the Senate, in part because of the war with Iran. The Democrats held it up recently and said they wouldn't move it forward, even though, as we both know, it's a highly bipartisan piece of legislation in any normal year. So the House, again, proudly says, we have done our job. We have passed it along to the Senate. Now you deal with it. Well, of course, this is another headache for Senate Majority Leader John Thune, because the NDAA version of the House has a lot of amendments that were added in, and it's possible that those will be unacceptable to many Democrats as well as some Republicans. Some of the things, as an example of things that were added, were the fact that it would loosen regulations to allow service members and civilian employees to carry firearms on military bases. There's also some changes in connection with TRICARE and the healthcare coverage that would change the regulations and guidelines for gender-related medical procedures. That is always an issue that comes up as sort of a poison pill for Democrats. And then there's the differences just in general terms in connection with military pay. In the House version, it's a staggered pay increase, starting with the lowest enlisted personnel would get about 7%, then goes up to 6% and 5%. In the Senate version, it's a flat 3.6% pay increase for military personnel. So a lot of things still to be worked out in the NDAA side on the Senate side.
And there's talk that they really won't even conference this until after the midterms.
Right. That's another really fascinating thing and frankly troubling to a lot of lawmakers, that this is something that usually, as you know, gets passed 6 decades in a row on time. But because of these differences and a variety of things, and of course, the elections themselves, they are not going to get together on this, I don't think, until you're right, until after the midterm elections. So this may be something that goes well deep into at least the start of the next fiscal year.
Mitchell Miller is Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, let's talk about the dynamics here a little bit. You hinted at it in a couple of places, but the House has tossed some, less than welcome gifts over the fence to their friends in the Senate. How is that playing out, and what does that mean for the dynamics going forward?
There is a bitterness between the lower chamber and the upper chamber. Of course, the House and Senate always have this inherent tension, but here you have the House and the Senate both controlled by Republicans. And what seems to be happening time and time again is that the House has to wrangle with this incredibly tight margin. They only can lose a couple of votes. And to his credit, House Speaker Mike Johnson last week, as I mentioned, got several pieces of significant legislation across the finish line, including, I didn't mention, but new restrictions on stock trading among lawmakers, which has long been talked about. So once the House gets these passed, they dump them over to the Senate, at least in the view of the Senate Majority Leader John Thune, and then he has to untangle all the different things that his conference don't like. And there's been real signs of tension, not only between the House and the Senate, but now also between the White House and Senate Majority Leader John Thune. Last week, Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, said that their patience of the president is running thin in connection with Senate Majority Leader John Thune getting the SAVE Act moved forward. Of course, the president has said this is his top priority. And then on the other side, John Thune said, well, look, if somebody can find me 50 votes on this to get this across the finish line, I'm happy to help. But I have to deal with the math realities here. One, that even if it's a reconciliation bill, if I don't have 50 votes on the Republican side, I can't get it through. And then, of course, if there's anything that's much larger with the Democrats and the filibuster, that's a whole nother story. So he is really feeling, I think, a lot of pressure, not only from the White House, which he's dealt with pretty deftly up to this point, but also I think he's frankly just getting tired of being blamed for everything not going the way that the president wants.
They're even splitting on some really basic policy. The House last week passed another war powers resolution, but the Senate rejected it. So with the White House talking about expanding combat operations, how meaningful are these votes and the disagreements that they reflect?
Well, I was on a call with Senate Virginia Senator Tim Kaine, who, as you know, has pushed very hard on these war powers resolutions. The most recent one was actually sponsored by Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen. That was the one that failed last week in the Senate, and then the one in the House, as you mentioned, passed. But basically, Senator Kaine said in addition to continuing to try to get these war powers resolutions brought to the floor and trying to pick up a few more Republican votes, he says the real power is going to be in connection with appropriations for the Defense Department. And he says if the White House continues to effectively ignore what Congress is saying about the war, then he thinks that's when Congress will do what it still can do, which is not appropriate the money for the war and not appropriate these supplemental requests, for example, that the Pentagon and the White House want. So I think that's going to be the next front in this battle between the White House and Congress.
Well, we're anxious to see how it all plays out for sure. As we wrap up here, though, I want to ask you a slightly more wonky question. And this gets to the housing bill that was passed a few weeks ago and enacted without the president's signature. One of the things we're hearing now from Congress is that, yay, we passed the bill, but now we're not sure who's at home in HUD to actually write the implementing regulations. And this is becoming an issue kind of across many departments and flows perhaps out of the DOGE issue, but also out of Loper Bright, the Supreme Court case from a couple of years ago. What are you hearing in conversations on the Hill about not just passing legislation, but actually being able to implement it?
There is a lot of concern related to that because, for example, as you mentioned, you have a housing bill that is widely considered to be the most significant housing bill passed in at least 3 decades. And so, yes, the checkered flag was waved and everybody was happy that it got passed. And of course, then we had the drama with the president actually not signing the bill. But more importantly to your question, does HUD actually have the staffing to get this implemented? I mean, there are a lot of very complicated issues in connection with this legislation. They've changed definitions, for example, related to block grants for low-income housing development. They've changed the standard for manufactured homes and how that would be implemented. And all of this, of course, requires rulemaking and changes to the current law, and it's all part of that legislation. And if you don't have the staffing that can actually crank all that out, it all is going to become moot. And as has been pointed out, the HUD has lost something along the lines of 1,800 personnel just over the last 2 or 3 years. So that's a real big issue for something that's a major affordability issue for many Americans. And then just related to some of the DOGE things that have happened, I was recently at a news conference where people that had been fired from USAID and who lost their jobs with the Foreign Service and the State Department. And one of the examples they pointed out is that once they were fired, then ultimately they had to, the agencies had to rehire people to do various things in connection with overseas outreach and a variety of humanitarian programs. And some of the people needed to be trained again to learn new languages. And keep in mind that millions of dollars had been spent already to train these other people who were then fired. So what I'm hearing a lot from lawmakers and from people that have been fired out of the federal government is that the savings just doesn't seem to really be there. It's, cutting your nose off to spite your face, that all of these programs where they initially said they cut a lot of people and they saved a lot of money, they're ending up having to spend more money to get people to replace them.
Sounds like across the board, some chickens may be coming home to roost.
Absolutely.
That's Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP, Mitchell Miller. Mitchell, thanks as always.
You bet.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is considering changes to decades-old radiation protection requirements. At issue is how regulators translate scientific risk into practical operating rules. But first, the Trump administration continues to champion deregulation. But agencies still have thousands of regulatory actions on their to-do list. You're listening to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The Trump administration has released its latest unified agenda. offering the clearest picture yet of what federal agencies expect to work on in the coming months. While the White House continues to emphasize deregulation, the agenda shows a government that remains deeply engaged in writing and revising rules. Joining me for a closer look, Will Yateman, the new director of the Regulatory Studies Center at George Washington University. Will, thanks so much for joining me. Welcome to the Federal Drive.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on.
You've just taken over the Regulatory Studies Center at the George Washington University. As you step into that job, what are the questions about regulation and governance that you're most interested in helping policymakers answer?
Oh, my. I think it's the regulatory instability that pervades our current system. And by this, I mean the most domestic policy is now emanating from the executive branch rather than the legislative branch. About 3,000 to 4,000 law-like rules annually, generally more if there's a Democratic administration and less if there's a Republican administration, of which roughly 50 to 100 annually on average are economically significant, meaning they entail regulatory costs of greater than $100 million. So what we've got here is this situation whereby because all this policy is executive branch driven, every 4 to 8 years, whenever there's a political changeover in the Oval Office, the machinery of government stops on a dime and pivots 180 degrees. And it's been this way, and increasingly so, only in the last 30-odd years. And this is no way to run a government. There's no way to run the greatest country on earth. And I think it's the rare regulatory talking point that resonates with anyone. I mean, I think on its face, it makes no sense.
That's a really important overarching decision that we are moving away from stability and moving to a world where policy swings as the administration's priorities and maybe even parties change. The Trump administration has just put out its Spring 25 Unified Agenda, which is its capturing of all of the regulatory actions that it's planning to undertake for the coming year. Your center's analysis found, as you said, almost 4,000 actions in this document. What's the biggest headline that listeners should take away from this?
Oh, geez. The biggest headline is that they're busy. This Unified Agenda, 2026 Unified Agenda, it contained 400 more active actions than there were in last year's Unified Agenda, regulatory actions. These are numbers commensurate with the spring agenda from President Biden's final year in office. And what we're seeing here is actually a new normal with respect to when administrations feel as though they've got to get rules out the door. So for decades, it's been the case that the key period by which administrations wanted to get their regulations completed was about 7 to 8 months before their final term, before their final year in office. This pertains to this mechanism in Congress known as the Congressional Review Act that allows a Congress to veto an executive branch measure. Setting that aside, the important point is, whereas for decades, this was the key 6-7 months out from your final year when it ended, that was the key to get all your rules out the door. With this administration, we're seeing something new, and it's a rush to get their regulations out the door, not in order to meet this Congressional Review Act, stave off that threat, but instead to control judicial review all the way through the close of the case, through the defense of the rule in question. The fear being that if a different administration were to, if you lose an election and you change over control of the White House and therefore the political direction of the Justice Department, that you couldn't, that in essence, a subsequent administration's Justice Department would pull their punches or refuse to defend a policy with which they disagree. So I think that's the top line takeaway is they're very busy. They're actually going to enter what is their busiest period of this second term, I would guess. And the reason for that is this new normal, whereby instead of trying to protect your regulations from being overturned by a subsequent administration by getting them out the door 6-7 months out from when your administration ends, the new normal, really starting with this administration, is getting all your regs done 2 years out. and giving you 2 years during which time your Justice Department, your administration can steward the defense of these rules in court.
That's a fascinating observation. And it requires an administration to really have done its homework before it takes office the first day. How are you seeing that timeline change preparation for a regulatory agenda?
Oh, wow. I would say with respect, this second administration has definitely been far more prepared than the first. I'd venture a guess that they didn't expect to win the first term, the Trump administration. And as such, they didn't participate in a traditional transition process from the Obama administration to the first Trump administration. Long-winded way of saying the first administration didn't have its act together on day one. They didn't have a management team in place, and that showed. It took them roughly 2 years to get their leadership team in place. The second administration was way different. Second administration, it was a mystery because they, again, didn't participate in the transition process, but they had a very well-orchestrated plan, and quite frankly, we're seeing that in terms of the difference between the strategic ends and, indeed, the means from the first administration to the second administration.
Will Yateman is the new director of the Regulatory Studies Center at George Washington University. Well, let's dig a little bit deeper then, because the Trump administration came in really touting a deregulatory agenda. And yet, as you've articulated, they're writing as many regulations, if not more, than the administrations that preceded them. How should people perceive that? Do you have to write regulation in order to deregulate, or are they adding to the regulatory pile?
It is, well, first, to answer to your last question, do they have to write regulations to deregulate? Yes. And that actually gets to this broader point that lends crucial context to your question, which is these thousands of active actions, this very busy period, these numbers that we've been bandying about regarding the 2026 Unified Agenda, they include both regulatory and deregulatory actions. And indeed, my colleague at the Regulatory Studies Center, Finn Dobkin, performed an independent analysis of the regulatory or deregulatory status of 173 active, economically significant rules. So that is, he took the subset of rules that cost more than $100 million that are active, and he looked at the breakdown of regulatory to deregulatory, and he found it was about 2-to-1 deregulatory to regulatory. So despite the big numbers, despite the big top-line numbers in the Unified Agenda, looking under the numbers, it is indicative of, indeed, yes, a very robust deregulatory effort, and one that, again, was going to kick up in earnest, very much so, over the next 6 months to beat this new normal deadline of 2 years out.
So when you think about those economically significant rules, rather than just the big raw numbers, in addition to a 2-to-1 deregulatory versus regulatory ratio, what else do you see in there? Are there priorities or agencies or types of rules or signals that indicate where this administration wants to leave its regulatory mark?
This is interesting. So, frankly, no. So last year's 2025 Unified Agenda by the Trump administration was rife with analysis and all sorts of claims and all sorts of bragging about their deregulatory agenda. I mean, it was just there was a great deal of analysis to that end. It was clearly this focus. It's much more cursory, or at least the qualitative narrative to this 2026 Unified Agenda with respect to deregulation. There's virtually no analysis whatsoever. Now, to be sure, in the about a page-and-a-half preamble, they do set forth their deregulatory aims. They frame it within the celebration of the 250th American anniversary, the Declaration of Independence and whatnot. But I found this very interesting. I and other regulatory analysts found it quite telling, or not telling, but interesting, that there was this disparity, that last year it was clearly frontline and center, and they spent a great deal of effort on this deregulatory narrative. This year, not so much. To be sure, there could be a discrepancy between words and actions. And again, I reiterate what I said before. Despite the lack of deregulatory narrative, they're entering full throttle into the busiest deregulatory period of the second Trump administration.
So for federal managers and agency leaders and maybe contractors and Congress who are looking at this, What lessons should they take here about where this administration is headed from a regulatory perspective and how serious it's going to be going forward about even increasing the work it's currently laid out on the table?
Oh, my. Well, I'll say this. The unified agenda, one of its virtues is the specificity with which it reports this survey of federal regulatory actions. So to the extent any member of the public, regulated community, or policymaker is curious about any agency's direction, and very specific over the next 12-odd months, this document would provide those answers. Regarding the Trump administration's, what is the future to tell? Again, I think right now we're going to enter a very, very busy period of administrative policymaking, and I expect that to continue through the second year of the Trump term. And then, quite frankly, given this new normal, given how all the priority regulations are going to be front-loaded in the first 2 years, I expect years 3 and 4 to entail a lot more far-reaching, perhaps tenuous efforts that perhaps are more directed towards politically pleasing elements of the base.
Will Yateman is the new director of the Regulatory Studies Center at George Washington University. Will, thanks so much for joining me, and good luck as you begin this important tenure.
Thank you so much, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is considering changes to decades-old radiation protection requirements. At issue is how regulators translate scientific risk into practical operating rules. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. For decades, federal radiation standards have been guided by the principle that exposures should be kept as low as reasonably achievable. Now, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is considering changes to that framework while maintaining the same scientific assessment of radiation risk. The debate centers on how regulators put that science into practice. Joining me to walk through the issue is Edwin Lyman, Director of Nuclear Power Safety at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Dr. Lyman, it's great to have you. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Let's talk about the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and a new rule that's out for comment. What exactly here is the NRC proposing to change, and why has it generated such a strong reaction from the radiation safety advocacy community?
The NRC's proposed rule takes on a wide range of requirements for protection of the public and workers and the environment against the exposure to ionizing radiation. And this is a very controversial action, in part because it was directed by the Trump administration's Executive Order 14300, which was issued last May, and which directed the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to take on a large number of activities, including reevaluating the way it regulates radiation risk. And because that is a political mandate and not a technically grounded one, this raises concern that the administration is trying to get the not only the Nuclear Regulatory Commission but also the Department of Energy to reduce its protections for the public and for workers against radiation exposure and the risks that come from that, including the potential for cancer.
There's some terminology here in the Union of Concerned Scientists statement that I want to make sure we clarify for our listeners. You note that the NRC continues to accept the linear no threshold model, and you mentioned ionizing radiation as well. Break down for us what that model says about risk and exposure and what kind of radiation ionizing radiation is.
Ionizing radiation is that kind of radiation which is energetic enough that it can strip electrons from atoms and molecules. And so that kind of damage to living things can affect, for instance, DNA and affect the ability of those cells to function properly. And so when radioactive materials decay or undergo fission, they release highly radioactive materials which can affect living things like the human body in different ways. And one of the most dangerous is its potential for disrupting genetic material and affecting cell division and potentially leading to cancer. And ionizing radiation exposure is one of the most well understood carcinogens in humans. The linear no threshold model is based on largely extrapolating epidemiological studies. So, for instance, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings in Japan in 1945, in addition to killing hundreds of thousands of people outright, also exposed many more to ionizing radiation. And that is leading to an epidemic of cancer among those survivors. And that provided a very good database for trying to understand the impacts of ionizing radiation. But there's a lower limit to the amount of exposure that that study can actually attribute, or there's a lower limit to the exposures to radiation that can be definitively associated with an outcome like cancer. And when you go below that limit, the data itself is not statistically significant. So people speculate about how dangerous radiation is at low doses, lower than what these studies can show. And so some people believe that perhaps there's a threshold and there's a safe level of radiation. Others might believe that low-level radiation is actually good for you. But the general scientific consensus is that even, there's no safe dose of radiation. And that's essentially what the linear no threshold model says. Not only is there no safe dose, but also that the harm, in particular the risk of cancer, is proportional to the dose.
And as a result of that model, then, the prevailing practice has been to keep the radiation exposure as low as reasonably achievable, or ALARA. The NRC rule proposes to remove that standard. Why would that be such a significant change?
Yes, the ALARA standard actually has been, I think, misconstrued. It was originally introduced as a way to help the operators of nuclear facilities, for example, by not specifying very strict limits for radiation exposure, but allowing them to take economic considerations into account when they set their own radiation limits. So it was actually supposed to be, essentially a relaxation of standards for these facility operators. But it's been misinterpreted now as an effort to force, again, operators of nuclear facilities to drive down doses as low as possible without regard to the cost. And the claim is that that's related to the notion that because there's no safe dose, you might as well, try to drive those doses down to zero. But in fact, ALARA was a way to essentially justify not reducing doses all the way to zero. However, it has led to good practices, for instance, for occupational radiation exposure, that have led to, U.S. nuclear workers receiving relatively low doses compared to the regulatory limits, and that can be attributed to ALARA, but it's also, again, good industrial hygiene practice.
Dr. Edwin Lyman is Director for Nuclear Power Safety at the Union of Concerned Scientists. So, Dr. Lyman, put this in practical terms. If these changes move forward, what could happen differently at nuclear facilities or cleanup sites or workplace that concerns you the most?
I would sum up this NRC proposed rule as saying that, yes, we understand that there's no safe dose of radiation, but we don't have to restrict radiation exposure as much, and we can allow it to increase because the resulting health impacts will be reasonable in comparison to the nation's or the Trump administration's goal of greatly expanding nuclear power. So they're essentially saying that, yes, if we implement this rule, it could lead to more cancers among radiation workers and the public, but that's okay because we need more nuclear power. And that to my mind, that is not the appropriate risk-benefit equation here. In fact, the biggest impacts could well be on radiation workers. And as I said, their doses are, on average, pretty low across the United States. But this rule could actually allow them to receive more than 25 times the current average dose that they get as part of this initiative to relax standards. And by relaxing those standards, it's simply a way of enabling nuclear facility operators to save money at the expense of providing good protection for workers. And it could lead to sloppier industrial practices, more potential accidents, more spills, less cleanup, and that isn't exactly an enticing environment for an industry that wants to attract more workers for what they see as a significant expansion. So I think it's wrongheaded in that respect as well. But we shouldn't be trying to save a little money at the expense of worker health and safety.
The rule is currently in its public comment phase. What questions do you think the NRC needs to answer before it makes a final decision here?
I think the NRC needs to justify in much greater detail why it thinks the eliminating ALARA is a good idea, independent of the Trump administration's dictum, because again, it could have a lot of unintended consequences, not only by discouraging more nuclear workers from entering the field, but also by increasing public concern and possibly reducing public acceptance for nuclear power. So they need to provide a much better justification for why they think they can relax these standards, allow the public, workers, and the environment to all experience greater levels of radiation how they can allow that to happen without providing a good technical justification.
Dr. Edwin Lyman is the Director for Nuclear Power Safety at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Dr. Lyman, thank you so much for joining me today and raising our awareness of this really important issue.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. As Space Force leaders argue that doubling the size of the newest branch of the military is a national security necessity, roughly 25% of the jobs within the service were unfilled in fiscal 2025, and the service lacks guidance for determining how many people it actually needs to accomplish its missions. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis is here with more. Anastasia, good to see you.
Hi, Terry.
What did the GAO find out about the size of the Space Force workforce?
Yeah, so the watchdog found that the Space Force had only filled about 13,500 roles of the roughly 18,000 positions it identified as necessary to carry out its missions in fiscal 2025. So that means that about 25% of required positions went unfilled in 2025. On top of that, the Space Force lost a lot of its civilian workforce due to the deferred resignation program and other efforts aimed at shrinking the size of the civilian workforce within the DoD. So the service already lost about 14% of its civilians. At the same time, as we've previously talked about it, Space Force leaders have been pushing for significant growth. They said that while achieving a force of just over 10,000 uniformed personnel, uniformed guardians in 2025 was a really significant milestone for the newest branch of the military, it's just insufficient moving forward for the missions that they have been assigned. So they're also requesting a major increase in spending. They're requesting $71 billion. So yeah, they're looking to grow, but when it comes to their workforce, according to the watchdog, they have these shortfalls and they don't actually know how many personnel they need to accomplish its missions.
So GAO found staffing gaps across uniformed service members across the civilian sector, but even those staffing gaps may not tell the full story. What else did GAO find?
What they found is that the service hasn't established a process to determine its personnel needs. And it also doesn't have a strategic workforce plan to kind of guide its future growth. There are units' personnel requirements that are based on legacy requirements from the former Air Force Space Command and other services space units. So those requirements are outdated, but they're still applied to the Space Force. And then also, some Space Force units' personnel requirements are based on a mix of analysis, and they're not consistent across the service. So you have these legacy requirements, you have these requirements that are based on a bunch of different analysis, and on top of that, they're not even tracking, or they're not accurately tracking, the number of contractors. And that's a problem because they rely significantly on contractor personnel support. But if they don't have reliable numbers for the contractors, it's really hard to understand how many personnel they need.
You and I have talked about some initiatives that Space Force is trying to recruit and retain people. Are there other workforce challenges beyond just number of people and number of seats that they're trying to solve here?
So even though, like we mentioned, they lost a bunch of civilian personnel, civilian Space Force service leaders said that they're trying at this current moment to hire about 100 civilians per month. They're looking to increase their uniformed personnel. GAO said that personnel shortfalls is a primary workforce challenge. However, they're struggling in other areas. So they're struggling with retaining cybersecurity and intelligence talent. They're struggling with increasing their enlisted ranks, and they're struggling with hiring civilian personnel, even though they have this goal of 100 civilians per month. That's due to recent DoD policy changes, so that's not surprising. And then it's also due to the competition from the private sector. But I wanted to highlight what GAO heard from Space Force officials about this. So, for instance, Space Systems Command, and they lost a lot of their civilians. They said that they're prioritizing resources for critical functions while kind of pausing for now some important non-critical functions. They said that while that relocation of resources does help to address kind of these most pressing needs, they say that it will most likely negatively affect growth and development of future capabilities.
How does all of this affect the Space Force's plans for future growth? Are they being told to solve their current problems and fill the existing shortfalls first, or are they moving forward with broader plans?
Yeah, I mean, they're pushing for more people, they're pushing for more money, but GAO does want them to develop guidance that is specific to the Space Force, that establishes a process that can accurately determine their personnel requirements. GAO also wants them to develop standard process to accurately and consistently track the number of contractor personnel. They want them to have a workforce plan to guide their future growth. But, like we discussed, they've been advocating for more people, but they're kind of going in blind. They don't exactly know how many personnel they need.
And within the Space Force itself, do they have the capacity to even build those plans?
That's a great question, and they will most likely need some help.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Anastasia, thanks for this story.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find all the details at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.